How could the Maya, such an advanced civilization, have disappeared? Welcome to Collapse, where giants fall. Today we explore through time into the depths of the Central American jungles, where an ancient civilization erected monumental cities, mastered the skies, and sculpted time itself. At its peak, it rivaled the world's greatest cultures, leaving behind colossal pyramids, enigmatic glyphs, and astronomical knowledge that defies imagination. Today, its temples are engulfed in vegetation, its plazas empty of inhabitants, and a millennial silence covers its masterpieces. What actually happened? But before we embark on a new adventure, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Thank you and bon voyage. When we mention pre-Columbian civilizations, the collective imagination often turns to lost cities buried under lush vegetation, imposing pyramids emerging from the canopy, and stelae engraved with mysterious symbols. Among these peoples who developed flourishing societies, the Maya civilization holds a special place. To start, it is important to geographically situate the Maya civilization, because, unlike other great pre-Columbian empires like the Aztecs or the Incas, it was not concentrated around a single major city or territory. The Maya occupied a vast and varied area, including present-day southeastern Mexico, particularly the states of Yucatan, Chiapas, and Tabasco, almost all of Guatemala, Belize, as well as northern Honduras and part of El Salvador. This geographic expanse explains the cultural and political diversity observed within the Maya world. Some cities were located in tropical jungles, others in coastal areas or on plateaus. Each environment posed specific challenges, such as water management, cultivating soils of varying fertility, and building roads to connect vast territories. The Maya skillfully took advantage of this variety of environments to establish a network of trade exchanges and cultural influences that extended well beyond the borders of their city-states. Chronologically speaking, Maya history is traditionally divided into three major periods. The first, known as the pre-classic, the second period, known as the classic, and finally the last period, known as the post-classic. Now let's trace back to the 19th century, when European explorers and adventurers, driven by a thirst for discovery, ventured into exploring Central America. Among them, American writer and traveler John Lloyd Stephens, accompanied by artist Frederick Catherwood, began in the early 1840s to visit little-known ruins that had been sporadically described by missionaries or colonial officials. In Guatemala, their path took them to the Petén jungle, where dense vegetation had concealed the remnants of a glorious past for centuries. One day, as they arduously made their way through vines, they suddenly found themselves facing immense pyramids swallowed by the forest, sprawling over acres. In front of them stood Tikal, one of the largest Maya cities of the Classic period, once at the heart of a sprawling political and religious network. Stephens and Catherwood, struck with astonishment, set out to document their find. This marked the beginning of a keen Western interest in the rediscovery of the Maya world. By the end of the second millennium before Christ, some nomadic or semi-nomadic populations of Central America began to exploit the agricultural potential of regions that would gradually become the heart of the Maya world. The lowlands of the Yucatan, in what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and northern Honduras. This slow but decisive transformation finds its origin in the domestication of maize, beans, and squash. These three plants formed an essential nutritional base, known as the Mesoamerican triad. Their coordinated cultivation in the same field was particularly ingenious. Corn served as a natural trellis for climbing bean plants, while squash leaves covered the ground to conserve moisture and limit the growth of weeds. Food resources thus produced offered various groups the possibility to settle more permanently, unlike their ancestors who had to move according to the hunting and gathering seasons. Over time, these camps transformed into rudimentary villages, with people gathering around water sources or in particularly fertile areas. The houses, initially made of perishable materials like wood and palm leaves, already testified to a desire to remain in place longer. This is how the first stone of the Maya civilization was laid. Food stability and the adoption of a sedentary lifestyle became the sine qua non condition for the development of a more complex social organization. Over the centuries, these villages grew, gaining in size and cultural importance. Some sites, unearthed today by archaeologists, provide a precious glimpse of these accomplishments. The site of Cuello in Belize is one of the oldest examples of a pre-classic Maya village. Dating back to around 1200 before Christ, it features the remains of structures built on basalt platforms, evidence of some planning and concern for sustainability. The inhabitants of Cuello were not content with just cultivating their fields. They also erected buildings dedicated to religious activities. Though modest compared to the colossal pyramids of the following centuries, these early ceremonial platforms showed that the villagers placed significant importance on religion and rituals. As the population increased, it became necessary to centralize certain activities, whether political, economic, or religious. This is how ceremonial centers developed, where villagers converged to worship the deities, engage in commercial exchanges, or settle inter-community disputes. These centers played a dual role. On one hand, they served as focal points for worship, and on the other, they strengthened the emerging authority of leaders or influential families capable of organizing these gatherings. Gradually, there was a consolidation of local hierarchies and the structuring of elites, whose members could claim to hold religious knowledge or possess mythical legitimacy. With the emergence of these ceremonial centers and the increase in exchanges, pre-classic Maya society became more hierarchical. At the head of these communities, there was often a village chief, sometimes supported by priests or shamans, responsible for interpreting the will of the gods and mastering the art of divination. The religious elites, although few at first, quickly acquired considerable influence. They occupied a central place in the management of rituals, sky observation, and predictions related to agricultural seasons. In a context where agriculture and the calendar determined the survival of the group, being able to predict the rainy season or announce the end of a drought conferred a high symbolic power. Consequently, the first charismatic leaders knew how to use this astronomical knowledge to legitimize their authority. Within the villages themselves, distinctions were already forming between those who owned land, resources, like obsidian or jade, and those who had to settle for participating in common work in exchange for protection and food. This stratification foreshadowed the more complex social organization that would reach its peak in the classical period. When approaching the art of the pre-classic period, it is easy to underestimate the scope of these early productions, as they may seem rudimentary compared to the monumental frescoes and sculptures of later centuries. Yet pre-classic art, notably pottery and clay figurines, already reveals an acute sense of religious and identity symbolism. The pottery, often decorated with geometric or animal motifs, served not only to store foodstuffs, but also to illustrate mythological scenes or symbols embodying prosperity and fertility. Anthropomorphic figurines, on the other hand, appear as one of the earliest forms of Maya artistic expression. They often represented deities related to the earth, rain, or corn, elements essential for the community's survival. Some were adorned with elaborate headdresses or jade accessories, suggesting that they also embodied certain aristocratic or shamanistic figures. Already, we notice the desire to depict beings endowed with supernatural power, highlighting the strong relationship between the sacred and the political in the nascent Maya society. One of the most remarkable characteristics of the Maya civilization lies in its hieroglyphic writing system, unmatched in complexity in pre-Columbian America. However, before the rise of Maya writing as it would be known later, the first attempts at written symbolization date back to this pre-classic period. Rudimentary glyphs, sometimes engraved on small steles or ceramics, have been discovered in certain Mesoamerican regions where the Maya evolved. The precise meaning of these symbols is still unknown, but several specialists see in them the seed of a system that would be perfected through contact with other cultures, notably the Olmecs. The emergence of a proto-writing system is particularly important in Maya cultural history, as it marks the intention to record certain information or events in a lasting way. Through these signs, it became possible to transmit religious, calendrical, or political knowledge from one generation to the next, without relying solely on oral tradition. This advancement in organizing thought and collective memory would constitute a major asset for the future classic Maya civilization. From its beginnings, the pre-classic Maya world did not live in isolation. The peoples settled in this region of Central America maintained various forms of contact with their neighbors, whether they were nearby tribes or more distant groups. Trade exchanges, sometimes over long distances, mainly involved rare or precious raw materials such as jade, obsidian, and salt. Jade, in particular, was highly symbolic. It was associated with life, regeneration, and later, royalty. Obsidian, derived from volcanic rock, was used to make high-quality knife blades and other sharp tools, which were in high demand and transported over long distances. Moreover, salt was a vital commodity not only for seasoning and preserving food, but also for potential rituals. The Maya communities exchanged agricultural surpluses, corn, beans, squash, for these indispensable resources. Trade routes have been found that connected the Maya inland areas to coastal zones. Among the cultural groups that profoundly influenced the pre-classic Maya civilization, the Olmecs hold a primary place. Active approximately between 1500 BC and 400 BC in the Gulf of Mexico region, the Olmecs are often considered the mother culture of Mesoamerica. They developed a highly sophisticated religious iconography centered on representations of jaguars, humanoid jaguar figures, and deities related to corn and rain. Although the Olmecs were not the only ones to influence the Maya, their role in transmitting symbolic motifs and ceremonial techniques proves to be decisive. For instance, Olmec stylistic elements can be found in certain Maya figurines from the pre-classic period, as well as in the iconography related to divine powers. Additionally, these contacts likely accelerated the evolution of a rudimentary writing system among the Maya, as the Olmecs themselves had a primitive system of glyphs. Beyond the artistic aspect, the Olmec culture was also marked by monumental constructions, such as the famous colossal basalt heads, and a worldview that revolved around the interaction between man, nature, and supernatural forces. All these elements were assimilated, reinterpreted, then integrated into the distinctly Maya culture, forming a fertile foundation for the centuries to come. In Maya society, corn was much more than just a food resource. It held a central place in cosmology and mythology. According to some Maya stories, later relayed in the Popol Vuh, a sacred text compiled during the colonial period but based on older myths, the gods created the first men from corn cobs after failing to use other materials like mud or wood. This belief underscores how much the survival and identity of the Maya people were associated with this grain. In daily life, corn was consumed in multiple ways, in the form of flatbreads, called tortillas, porridge, called atole, or mixed with beans in stews. Corn led to many propitiatory rituals. People prayed for good harvests and to thank Mother Earth. The grains were sometimes used as offerings placed on altars. Women played a key role in the preparation of corn. They cooked it, ground it on stone mills, called metates, to turn it into dough and prepared family meals. This daily activity illustrates the strong everyday presence of corn, both in ritual and ordinary life. In these early sedentary societies, understanding natural cycles was crucial to ensure everyone's subsistence. From the pre-classic period, the Mayas rudimentarily developed their first astronomical observation tools. It was not yet the complex science seen in the classic period, with alignments of temples perfectly following the movements of the sun and Venus, but rather seasonal markers to predict rainfalls or establish an approximate agricultural calendar. Priests and shamans, who played a central role in the community, relied on the observation of the stars to determine the best time for planting or harvesting. Early ceremonial structures were sometimes arranged to align certain platforms with the sunrise or sunset at the equinox, marking a crucial moment for the harvests. Gradually, this notion of time measurement strengthened and gave rise to increasingly elaborate calendars, an essential basis of the future complex counting system and the cyclical time vision characteristic of Maya civilization. Chronologically, Maya history is traditionally divided into three major periods. The second period, known as the Classic, covers approximately the years 250 to 900. It is arguably the peak of Maya civilization in political, artistic, and scientific terms. This period is subdivided into two main phases: the early Classic, from 250 to 600, and the late Classic, from 600 to 900. The multiplication of independent city-states, such as Tikal in the Petén region of Guatemala, Calakmul in the Mexican state of Campeche, Palenque in Chiapas, or Copán in Honduras, illustrates the exceptional vigor of the early Classic. Each of these cities established itself as a political and religious power, led by a supreme ruler, the Kuhul Ajau, sacred lord. Around this king gravitated high dignitaries, responsible for managing public affairs, organizing cult rites, and overseeing diplomacy. Priests, custodians of esoteric knowledge, played an essential role in interpreting celestial phenomena and calendars. Artisans, for their part, created a wide variety of objects, from polychrome pottery to jade jewelry, including monumental stone and stucco sculptures. Merchants traveled vast exchange networks, bringing back rare resources like cocoa, obsidian, and the precious quetzal feathers. Lastly, the farmers, who were the majority, provided both labor dedicated to agriculture and contributed to the construction of monumental buildings. This density of autonomous political entities is partly explained by the relative abundance of natural resources, notably the fertility of the tropical soils that favored demographic expansion. Moreover, the quest for prestige drove each royal lineage to equip itself with increasingly imposing monuments and to perfect its institutions. Religion, omnipresent, served as the foundation for royal legitimacy. The ruling lineage was considered to stem from a divine will, and public ceremonies helped reinforce this sacred power. As the dynasties asserted themselves, the city-states entered into competition, each trying to surpass the other by the scale of its architecture, the sophistication of its art, and the solidity of its foreign policy. One of the notable features of this period is the emergence of an elaborate writing system, composed of glyphs representing both sounds and concepts. On stelae, these large commemorative stone pillars, the Mayas engraved political events, major ceremonies, and military exploits. Thanks to these inscriptions, archaeologists have been able to reconstruct the history of countless royal lineages, their alliances, as well as the precise chronology of their reigns. The Mayas relied on a complex calendar including 2 cycles, the Tzolk'in, a ritual calendar of 260 days, and the Hab, a cycle of 365 days corresponding to the solar year. Through an ingenious system of interlocking, these 2 calendars formed a cycle of 52 years, marking a kind of symbolic recommencement for religious and political life. Beyond the commemorative aspect, the power of writing was inscribed in a form of sacredness. The word laid down on stone or in codices, these accordion-folded books on bark, exerted a spiritual function. The priest scribes, almost exclusively, held this knowledge, consequently playing a key role in the transmission of myths, astronomical knowledge, and historical narratives. The early classic also marks the apogee of Maya architecture and urban planning. In the cities, immense stepped pyramids soared toward the sky, served as foundations for temples, and hosted major ceremonies. The Mayas had great mastery of stone, arranging limestone blocks by stacking and covering everything with stucco decorated with bas-reliefs or frescoes. The palaces, often built on platforms, housed the royal residence and comprised several levels. Richly decorated inner courtyards with sculptures evoking gods and ancestors adjoined audience halls sometimes adorned with stone benches. Observatories, circular or semicircular buildings, were designed for observing the stars and collecting data vital for establishing calendars. In addition to these monumental achievements, Maya engineering covered water management and soil development. In certain regions, large-scale canals allowed water to be drained or brought to reservoirs to mitigate drought during prolonged dry seasons. Communities also constructed irrigation systems and developed terraced fields to protect soils from erosion while maximizing agricultural production. The interior walls of some major buildings were adorned with extremely colorful paintings depicting ritual scenes, while the exterior was adorned with monumental sculptures, sometimes polychrome. This love of detail reveals the existence of highly specialized artisans invested in an aesthetic quest in service of political and religious power. Politically, the Maya world of the early classic was not centralized. On the contrary, each city-state had its own ruler and intended to maintain its autonomy. Diplomatic relations were most often organized around matrimonial alliances. The hand of a princess, promised to a neighboring ruler, often sealed peace and exchanged pledges of loyalty. This practice ensured that the 2 ruling families were linked by a common interest, the prosperity of their offspring and the stability of the region. However, these alliances were not always durable, and cities could easily change camps if their interests required it. The legendary rivalry between Tikal and Calakmul is a perfect illustration of these political dynamics. Tikal, nestled in the heart of the Guatemalan jungle, was already an established power seeking to extend its influence over trade routes leading north and east. Calakmul, located in the lowlands of Campeche, was also striving to consolidate its role as a regional power. The two centers clashed repeatedly, alternating periods of open hostility with truces achieved through dynastic marriages or trade agreements. From time to time, other cities allied with one camp or the other, forming genuine provisional confederations aimed at expanding their domination over important trade routes or promising agricultural territories. These power struggles complicated the political map of the Maya world and, by extension, stimulated cultural innovation, as each ruler sought to demonstrate their superiority through the erection of monuments and the expansion of their religious influence. On the level of daily life, the era of the early Classic presents a vibrant vitality. Markets, organized regularly, were true hubs of local and regional commerce. There, one could find maize, the staple food used to make tortillas, along with beans, peppers, and squashes. The most prestigious products, such as cacao, were highly prized for making bitter drinks, sometimes reserved for the elite or dedicated to sacred rites. Quetzal feathers, symbols of nobility and vitality, held an exceptional place in fashion. They adorned the headdresses of kings and priests, conferring both presence and spiritual aura. Colorful textiles were also exchanged among the upper classes, reflecting variations in status and affiliation with a particular city. The ball game, or pak-to-pak, embodies another prominent feature of Maya culture. On a court framed by walls, players had to propel a rubber ball using their hips, forearms, or sometimes rudimentary bats, with the goal of getting it through a stone hoop. While the playful aspect was indeed present, this competition held primarily a religious significance. It symbolized the mythological confrontation between life and death, and represented the challenge of heroes against the powers of the underworld. In some configurations, the fate of the losers could even result in their sacrifice to ensure cosmic balance. Moreover, artisans excelled in crafting statues, masks, figurines, and in producing polychrome pottery decorated with narrative or geometric motifs. Jade, associated with fertility and longevity, was one of the most valued materials, often worked into pendants or crown ornaments. The scientific advances of the early Classic profoundly influenced social and political organization. Priest astronomers multiplied their observations and managed to calculate lunar and solar cycles with great precision, as well as predict eclipses. They placed particular importance on the planet Venus, whose appearances and disappearances sometimes determined the opportune moment for war or the holding of significant ceremonies. This astronomical expertise was closely linked to religious beliefs. The celestial vault, observed from high towers, was considered an open book to divine will. For the Maya, the universe consisted of several interconnected worlds, each playing a fundamental role in the balance of the cosmos. At the deepest level was the Xibalba, the underworld, a subterranean realm governed by powerful deities. It was not only a place of death, but also a passage, a space of trials for souls after life. Its entrance was hidden in the depths of the earth, often symbolized by cenotes, these natural freshwater wells that opened like doors to the invisible. The Maya conducted rituals, offerings, and sometimes even sacrifices there, convinced that these waters led directly to the gods of the underworld. Above, the world of humans, the Earth, was the center of this cosmic structure. It was a sacred space where cities rose as reflections of the sky, organized according to the cycles of time and divine wills. Every mountain, every forest, every river was a link between terrestrial and celestial forces, an echo of the cosmic order. Finally, high above stretched the sky, the domain of the great deities and the astral powers. It was populated by gods who governed the sun, the rain, and the stars, whose movements dictated the rhythm of the seasons and rituals. The Maya cosmos was not static. These worlds intertwined, and the rites performed on Earth ensured harmony between humans, gods, and the spirits of the underworld. Between the years 600 and 750 AD, the Maya civilization reached its peak. Major sites such as Tikal, in the present-day department of Petén in Guatemala, experienced unprecedented growth. According to archaeological estimates, Tikal may have then housed several tens of thousands of inhabitants, perhaps up to 50,000 or 60,000, spread across a complex urban fabric. This population density was supported by advanced infrastructure networks, including stone-paved roads, drainage channels for agriculture, and reservoirs to collect rainwater. Maya engineers, aware of the karstic nature of certain regions where groundwater is difficult to access, emphasized the storage of water on the surface. This issue of water supply became a major concern, hence the necessity of digging and maintaining vast artificial basins around which urban life was organized. Simultaneously, there was a notable intensification of agriculture. Communities relied on slash and burn farming, a practice involving clearing and burning forested areas to plant corn, beans, and other essential food varieties. However, in areas where the terrain allowed, they also developed terrace systems to retain soil and moisture, thus increasing yields. Additionally, in swampier or low-relief areas, drainage channels were dug to regulate moisture and prevent the accumulation of stagnant water. This agricultural expansion responded to the need to feed a growing population, attracted by the promise of prosperity and the protection offered by the priest kings. As Maya rulers consolidated their authority, they ordered the erection of increasingly monumental structures to assert their power. The temple pyramids, often topped with sanctuaries richly decorated with glyphs and sculptures, stood out in the landscape. Each new leader sought to surpass his predecessors in the scale and splendor of their constructions. Stelae erected in public squares commemorated military feats, religious ceremonies, and diplomatic alliances. Precise dates were engraved on them. This desire to leave a mark on stone translated into a quest for legitimacy and recognition, but also a rivalry between neighboring cities to attract the attention of gods and men. Among these monuments, some stand out for their gigantism and symbolic importance. The La Danta Pyramid at El Mirador is a striking example. With its 72 meters in height and colossal volume, it surpasses in mass the Great Pyramids of the Classic era. Yet, it was built long before this period, at a time when the first great Maya cities were still emerging from the jungles of Petén. During the Classic era, other monumental structures rose, rivaling in grandeur and architectural refinement. In Tikal, Temple 4, reaching nearly 70 meters, towers over the canopy and symbolizes the city's power. Calakmul, the great rival, also equipped itself with massive pyramids, some reaching 55 meters in height. In Copán, to the south, the famous hieroglyphic stairway, engraved with thousands of glyphs, attests to the ruler's desire to fix their legacy in stone. Further north, Uxmal and Chichén Itzá perfected architecture with buildings featuring finely carved facades and structures like the Pyramid of the Magician, or El Castillo, which demonstrate an advanced mastery of mathematics and astronomy. However, behind these architectural achievements, the first signs of increasing environmental pressures were already looming. Paleo-environmental analyses suggest that, starting from the 8th century, a major climate change impacted the Maya region. Sediment cores taken in the lakes of Petén, Guatemala, and in several other areas of the Yucatan Peninsula revealed a significant decrease in rainfall from that time. The layers of sediments testify to periods of recurring drought, which spanned several decades or even more than a century. Archaeologists have noted the existence of progressive deforestation around city-states, a direct consequence of the search for arable land and the need to supply wood for construction, heating, and rituals. The tropical forests, rich in biodiversity, also provided essential raw materials, medicinal plants, resins for incense, birds with colorful feathers used in royal ornamentation. But, over the decades, the exploitation of these resources intensified, leading to a gradual impoverishment of the environment. The ruling elites pursued vast architectural programs, requiring a large workforce and ever-increasing construction materials: stones, lime, wood for scaffolding and roofing. This growth dynamic, combined with the need to supply a growing urban population, exerted unprecedented pressure on the ecosystem. At the same time, several natural disasters, such as unpredictable floods and the multiplication of hurricanes, highlighted the vulnerability of dike and canal systems. Coastal cities along the Atlantic sometimes experienced sudden flooding, while others further inland suffered from deluges due to intense rainfall over short periods. Oral chronicles, reconstructed from current stories and certain inscriptions, mention significant damage to infrastructure, such as dams or large stone causeways, crucial for the circulation of goods and water management. In parallel, the political stability of the city-states began to weaken. The need to fund large military campaigns and gigantic architectural projects weighed heavily on society. The lower classes, already subjected to agricultural labor, also had to contribute to the construction of temples, palaces, and large ceremonial platforms. The priest kings and nobles justified these burdens by invoking divine protection and the promise of a stable cosmic order. By ensuring prosperity through rituals, the elites claimed to avert droughts, floods, and epidemics. However, this rhetoric began to wear thin as difficulties mounted. In some glyphs, it is evident that the mentioned sacred wars became more frequent, suggesting a substantial increase in conflicts. Despite alliances sealed by spectacular royal marriages, mistrust between the cities persisted, creating a climate of political and military tension. Another factor of fragility was the crucial dependence on water stored in reservoirs. In the karstic regions of the Yucatan, rainwater quickly infiltrates into the depths of the earth through networks of caves and underground rivers, sometimes leaving the surface dry. The Maya had to develop a highly efficient organization to collect water during the rainy seasons. They arranged artificial basins lined with clay, dammed natural depressions to create reserves, and constructed diversion canals. When the rains were abundant, these reserves allowed them to get through the dry season. However, if a drought prolonged or several successive years saw diminished rainfall, the system became vulnerable. By the end of the 7th century, some signs suggested that the golden age of the classic period might be on the verge of crumbling. In several cities, archaeologists have noted a decrease in the erection of dated stelae. The inscriptions, once abundant, became rarer, which suggests that the royal power was experiencing turbulence. Fewer stelae could mean a lack of resources to finance dedications or an internal conflict preventing the organization of these lavish ceremonies. Similarly, Traces of fires and voluntary destructions have been identified in some palace complexes, suggesting revolts or struggles to take control of symbolic places. Excavations at Dos Pilas, a city in western Petén, have revealed levels of destruction corresponding to violent episodes, perhaps during attacks by rival cities. During the maturity period, city-states actively traded prestige goods over long distances. Jade, marine shells, cocoa, and obsidian circulated within merchant networks. These transactions consolidated the status of the elites, who controlled the distribution of these exotic objects. However, by the middle of the 8th century, archaeological evidence suggests a reduction in these large-scale trade flows. The more isolated cities accumulated fewer precious goods, while El Chayal obsidian from Guatemala or spondylus shells from the Pacific coasts became rarer in some locations. This decrease in trade intensity could indicate a politically hostile or uncertain climate, making it more difficult to secure trade routes. At the same time, the Mayas maintained their religious practices and attempted to preserve cosmic order through increasingly spectacular ceremonies. Glyphic inscriptions and wall murals indicate that human sacrifices became more frequent, especially during events perceived as decisive for the city's stability: consecration of a new temple, enthronement of a king, or celebration of a military victory. The ritual ball game, sometimes called Pak ta Pak, could also end in a bloody sacrifice, symbolizing the world's regeneration. The heads of war captives, offered to the gods as trophies, were believed to nourish divine forces and prevent famines. In engraved representations, one can glimpse the anguished faces of prisoners with bound hands, destined for a tragic fate in the sacred arena. This recourse to ritual violence reflected the anxieties of an elite fearing a cosmic imbalance if they failed to perform the appropriate rituals. The elites, fearing the loss of their authority, intensified their religious ceremonies, multiplying offerings and acts of sacred war. These wars, with both territorial and symbolic objectives, allowed for the capture of captives to be sacrificed and thus gain the approval of the deities. The glyphs suggest that as time progressed, conflicts became more frequent and sometimes extremely destructive, affecting a large number of major sites. Calakmul, Tikal, Copán, and Palenque vied to consolidate their spheres of influence. Alliances were made and broken based on fortunes of war. A military defeat could lead to a dynasty change and the establishment of a new lineage on the throne. One of the direct consequences of this increase in conflicts was the palpable overexertion within the population. Human resources were continually demanded to defend the city, build new fortifications, repair damage caused by sieges, and participate in major projects commissioned by a king keen on demonstrating his prestige. The construction of temples and palaces also required abundant labor, poorly fed, and little regarded. One can imagine the exhaustion generated by this relentless pace of chores, in a context where the climate was not always favorable and harvests could prove disappointing. Social tensions then simmered, ready to explode at the slightest drop in authority by the leaders. Anecdotal details, gathered through iconography and glyph reading, further add to this picture of weakening. Wall murals discovered at Bonham Pack, famous for their colorful depictions of battle scenes and religious rites, show mutilated and humiliated prisoners. The sacred wars were coupled with a desire to terrorize the opponent. The ambition was to break the morale of competing cities, destroy their protective idols, and dismantle their political authority. The The first signs of weakness were also manifested by the gradual isolation of some cities. Once connected by powerful alliances or thriving trade routes, these cities suddenly found themselves left behind. A defeated protector, a broken alliance, and the usual flow of prestige, goods abruptly stopped. Without access to these exchanges, local elites lost their aura of exoticism, unable to surround themselves with jade, quetzal feathers, or painted ceramics with refined designs. This further reinforced the political fragmentation of the Maya area, as each city-state sought to compensate for its losses by attacking weaker neighbors. This multiplication of skirmishes and open wars contributed to a climate of almost permanent instability during the second half of the 8th century. In this troubled context, we witness the gradual collapse of the great urban centers that had until then flourished in the heart of the jungle. At Copán, a major site located in the valley of the same name, monumental inscriptions abruptly cease around the mid-9th century. Until then, the stelae narrated the dynastic history of a powerful royal lineage, but the last clearly engraved date refers to a commemoration in the year 822. After this period, no significant sculptures or public inscriptions were erected there. A similar scenario occurs at Palenque, in the current state of Chiapas in Mexico, where artistic and architectural activity extinguishes shortly after the death of its great rulers. Tikal, one of the most famous cities in the Petén, also sees its monumental production drastically decrease, with unfinished pyramids and deserted palaces. As for Calakmul, another influential center of power in the south of the Yucatan Peninsula, it experiences a comparable situation. The progressive cessation of construction work and the absence of new stelae testify to the withdrawal, or even abandonment, of the ruling class. Archaeologists have found, at these sites, concrete evidence of social and economic collapse. Palaces have been left as they were, with construction projects suddenly halted, sometimes just after the first layers of stone were laid. The houses of the elite, once animated by lavish ceremonies, reveal a lack of maintenance and transformations into makeshift storage places, signaling that the population was likely trying to conserve the few available food supplies. The artistic production, once a marker of prestige for the Maya kings who competed in splendor, fades considerably, reflecting the erosion of resources, as well as a loss of local elites' power of attraction. Meanwhile, the political and social crisis intensifies. Alliances that once linked the various cities, ensuring the security of a vast commercial and supply network, disintegrate. Monumental inscriptions, very abundant in the previous century, give way to rare accounts of conflicts between rulers or even internal overthrows. The elites, weakened by economic difficulties, struggle to maintain order and consensus in their domains. Revolts become more frequent, fueled by the discontent of an impoverished rural population. The fragmentation of royal power is observed in the multiplication of smaller, less centralized political entities, no longer able to manage large irrigation projects or construction programs of religious buildings. Trade routes, essential for the supply of obsidian, jade, or cacao, closed due to hostilities, further isolating some cities already affected by famine. Food shortages settle in several regions of the Maya world, triggering more or less localized famines. Some rural communities, unable to meet their needs, abandon their traditional habitat to migrate to less drought-exposed areas or closer to reliable water sources. These population movements further undermine the economy of urban centers as the workforce becomes scarcer. This triggers a vicious cycle: fewer workers for agriculture and construction, fewer soldiers to defend the cities, and an increased vulnerability to looting. The rulers, who once drew their legitimacy from their ability to ensure the prosperity of their subjects, see their power waver and internal tensions explode. The discovery of makeshift fortifications around certain cities clearly indicates an escalation of violence. The term total wars used by some specialists today is justified by the nature of these conflicts. They were no longer just ritual wars aimed at capturing high-ranking prisoners, but real territorial struggles in which the survival of the population was at stake. The armies, or at least the combat forces raised by kings or clan chiefs, then equipped themselves with more varied armaments. Arrowheads, spears, or javelins made of obsidian, as well as clubs and shields made of wood reinforced with leather or resin, became more common. The large stele, which formerly extolled the diplomatic or matrimonial exploits of a sovereign, now depicts scenes of capturing and sacrificing enemy kings, a clear sign of the growing brutality. Victims of royal or noble rank are displayed to inspire fear, and their ritual execution serves a need to legitimize a wavering power in the blood of opponents. The chronicles and inscriptions, fragmentary but eloquent, sometimes mention desperate attempts by certain kings to re-establish their authority. Many of them meticulously initiated new sacred construction projects, erecting small temples on the ruins of former ceremonial complexes. Even if resources were lacking, the will to revive religious fervor and demonstrate unchanged power remained. However, closely looking at the foundations of these edifices often reveals an assembly of poorer quality materials, or the use of recycled blocks, indicating that they had to make do with whatever was available. In some cases, these attempts had the opposite effect of what was intended. The labor force requisitioned for these projects was paid at the expense of agricultural production, and the rural population had to provide extra work. This further fueled popular resentment and internal conflicts, hastening the abandonment of sites already in decline. Oral narratives, reconstructed from traditions still present among contemporary Mayas and rare colonial transcriptions, recount the anger of the gods, particularly that of the maize god, known by different names depending on the region. For many communities, the prolonged drought was nothing other than divine punishment inflicted on humans for their poor management of soil and ecosystems. It is reported that some priests, lacking prestige, would have ordered rituals of self-sacrifice and increasingly large offerings, whose cost depleted the community's last reserves. Various iconographic records show deities associated with death and desolation taking a prominent place, reflecting a general atmosphere of anxiety and loss of bearings. This slow degradation of the spiritual and political bond fueled fear and tension in a society where religion and royal power were deeply intertwined. On the ground, the remains of several mass graves constitute a sad testimony of the increased violence and mortality of this era. Throughout the Maya area, one observes mass graves, sometimes located near walls, marking perhaps the desperate defense of a besieged city. The corpses show signs of blows from bladed weapons, and skull fractures indicate brutal executions. Anthropological analyses have shown that these mass graves did not house only warriors, but also civilians, including women and children. In certain regions, carbon-14 dating connects these mass graves to the range 800-900, perfectly corroborating the time of the crisis. More ordinary burials, once honored with a certain decorum, offerings, and painted ceramics, become rare, as if time and means were lacking to respect funeral customs. All this indicates a very advanced degree of disorganization and distress. Throughout the 9th and early 10th centuries, most political elites failing to restore lasting prosperity faded away, swept aside by revolts, wars, or simply the exodus of the population. The sprawling cities, once so vibrant, gradually emptied. The jungle reclaimed its rights over abandoned pyramids, ceremonial plazas, and palaces. The few remaining traces of occupation show that during this demographic void, only a few isolated groups remained on site or returned sporadically to extract materials. This situation led to a pronounced archaeological silence in the Petén region. Stelae were no longer erected, buildings were no longer expanded, and hieroglyphic inscriptions became much rarer. Simultaneously, there was a demographic shift to the north of the Yucatan Peninsula in present-day Mexico, where cities like Chichén Itzá and Uxmal are located. One hypothesis put forward to explain this movement of populations is the search for regions with fewer risks related to water resources. The northern part of the peninsula, while lacking large rivers, has numerous cenotes, natural sinkholes serving as wells, that allow for more predictable freshwater supply. Uxmal, in the so-called Puke region, is renowned for its refined architecture characterized by intricately carved stone facades and complex geometric motifs. This city became, in the 10th century, an essential hub, just like Chichén Itzá, which stands out for its commercial openness and architectural innovations. The groups that migrated to these new centers inaugurated a new era, commonly called the post-classic period, during which the old political models adapted and reinvented themselves. During this transition, the Maya civilization did not disappear but reconfigured. New centers emerged, and among them, Chichén Itzá, Mayapan, and Uxmal played a prominent role. Chichén Itzá, meaning at the edge of the Itzá's well, reached its peak between the 10th and 13th centuries. Mayapan, in turn, became a prosperous city in the 12th century, relying on a political confederation that aimed to restore a form of unity among the different Maya entities of the Yucatan. These new political elites sought to recreate solid alliances and introduce sometimes more collegial governance systems, even though internal rivalries persisted. The dynasties claiming descent from the great kings of Petén sought to legitimize their power by symbolically linking themselves to ancient cults, while integrating new artistic and religious elements from other Mesoamerican regions, notably the Toltec area, located further northwest, near the ancient capital Tula. In this post-classic period, iconography and architectural styles underwent profound transformations. While the classic period was marked by the construction of slender pyramids, topped with temples intended for astronomical rituals, the post-classic centers featured reliefs of Toltec inspiration, as evidenced by representations of warriors and war-related deities. Puke art, developed in the Uxmal region, is characterized by lattice-like geometric motifs, an abundance of chak masks, rain god, on facades, and an almost obsessive symmetry in the exterior decoration. In Chichén Itzá, some buildings such as the Temple of the Warriors or the famous Castillo, Pyramid of Kukulkan, illustrate the fusion between Maya style and Toltec influences. The bas-reliefs increasingly highlight scenes of battle and sacrifice, while the long hieroglyphic texts, so frequent during the classic period, become more concise and less discursive. On the commercial front, the immediate post-collapse period also led to a redirection of trade routes. The cities of Petén, previously interconnected by land and river routes, gave way to connections more oriented towards the sea. It was at this time that maritime trade developed more intensively, particularly with populations settled on the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean coasts. There is sometimes mention of a strong presence of Maya merchants on the island of Cozumel, which became an important maritime crossroads. Ceramics, prestige objects, obsidian, and even cacao, a highly prized commodity throughout Mesoamerica, circulated more rapidly by sea than via the old forest paths. In such a context, major political alliances are reorganizing, as evidenced by the confederation between Chichén Itzá, Mayapan, and Uxmal, sometimes referred to as the League of Mayapan. According to several later documents, these cities attempt to restore the political and religious grandeur of the Maya world, while adapting to the new power dynamics imposed by these military alliances. Rival dynasties multiply their attempts for expansion and consolidation of central power, not without conflict. The stories of the time, some fragments of which are preserved in colonial writings, recount succession disputes, palace intrigues, and struggles for influence over the sacred cenotes, essential sites for religious rituals. However, these internal confrontations undermine the stability of the confederation, which eventually disintegrates, leaving Mayapan to dominate the regional scene for a time, before it too succumbs to internal dissension, sometime during the 13th or 14th century. In parallel, the art of this post-classic period illustrates a marked evolution toward more refined styles in certain cities like Uxmal. Frescoes discovered in this city show a less abundant iconographic register than during the classic period, with fewer dynastic stories and more representations related to daily life or minor deities. The famous nunnery quadrangle at Uxmal displays sumptuous puke decoration, but some of the later additions reveal a desire for sobriety, perhaps related to political uncertainties and social transformations. These frescoes also reveal a desire to appeal to a broader population, depicting warriors, peasants, or priests in less solemn contexts than those of major ceremonies. Many archaeologists believe that this society in reconfiguration is going through a phase of experimentation where the glorious past remains a source of inspiration without preventing the adoption of new practices introduced via trade routes. Towards the end of the 15th century, the situation evolved as new forces appeared on the horizon. European maritime expeditions, led by the Portuguese and the Spanish in search of routes to Asia, eventually navigated along the shores of the Yucatan Peninsula. Although the precise dates of the first direct contacts aren't all clear, testimonies suggest that even before Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Antilles in 1492, some European sailors might have glimpsed these distant lands. Soon after, accounts detail Spanish expeditions fleeing shipwrecks or seeking to explore new territories. For the Maya, this period marks the beginnings of an era of unprecedented upheavals, which would culminate in the Spanish conquest at the beginning of the 16th century. Later chronicles, such as those compiled in various manuscripts of the Chilam Balam, preserve the memory of this past, evoking the specter of a world that was about to change irreversibly. These texts of the Chilam Balam, partially written after the conquest, remain a valuable source for understanding how the Maya themselves interpreted the arrival of these foreigners. They contain prophecies, mythical tales, and historical annals, providing an indigenous perspective on the transition to the colonial era. The proper names mentioned are not always identified with certainty, and the dating of events is often approximate from a Western point of view. Nevertheless, they offer a living testimony of the cultural resistance of Maya communities in the face of the upheaval caused by the arrival of the Spaniards. As Iberian domination expanded, these chronicles took on an even more symbolic character, since their very writing defied the Spanish prohibition on using ancient glyphs and traditional religious practices. According to some sources, a shipwreck around 1511 led several foreigners to settle among the Maya, including Gonzalo Guerrero, who, according to accounts, adopted local customs and later fought against the Iberian soldiers. Despite this rare example of a European in the service of a Maya city, the majority of the troops arriving subsequently on the Yucatan coasts were tasked with subjugating the region in the name of the Spanish crown. During the 1520s, the situation evolved when conquistadors such as Francisco de Montejo launched the conquest of Yucatan starting in 1527. His expeditions encountered strong opposition from the various Maya kingdoms, but the latter failed to unite permanently due to long-standing rivalries. The Battle of Chacan Putum in 1517 had already demonstrated the impact of firearms and artillery on the morale and effectiveness of local forces, even though the Maya defenders were able to inflict losses on the first Spanish contingents. Over the course of campaigns conducted between 1527 and 1546, Montejo and his captains established fortified posts and sometimes formed temporary alliances with certain Maya groups eager to free themselves from the rule of their traditional rivals. Diseases inadvertently brought by Europeans, such as smallpox and measles, proved particularly deadly in the non-immune local communities, thus facilitating the advance of the conquest. In the 1540s, colonial cities like Merida were founded, sometimes on the ruins of pre-existing cities like Tahoe, which definitively consolidated Spanish control in the peninsula. By the mid-16th century, resistance was concentrated in remote regions such as the Petén, where several enclaves preserved their independence. At the same time, the destruction of the Maya religious and cultural heritage intensified, as during the auto da fe of Mani in 1562, led by Diego de Landa. He burned hieroglyphic codices as well as sacred representations, causing an irreparable loss for the transmission of local knowledge and traditions. Despite brief revolts, the colonial organization, based in part on the encomienda system, contributed to dispersing the population and compelling it to provide labor to the colonists. In the Petén, the Itzá kingdom remained independent until the last third of the 17th century. In March 1697, the island city of Nojpetén, today Tayasal, was stormed by Spanish troops who crossed Lake Chichén Itzá on armed boats. The conquest of this stronghold, which was burned after its capitulation, marked the end of organized resistance and secured the definitive submission of the region to the power of the Spanish crown. In the eyes of the chroniclers of the time, the collapse of political and religious structures during the second half of the 16th century, followed by the fall of the last independent strongholds at the end of the 17th century, marks the almost complete destruction of the Maya civilization. Wars, epidemics, and forced labor reduced the population, while the disappearance of many hieroglyphic codices deprived subsequent generations of direct access to their written traditions. Despite these upheavals, some cultural elements survived, partly thanks to oral transmission and the writing of texts in the Latin alphabet that preserved some of the previous knowledge and beliefs. One of the most enduring legacies of the post-classic period lies in the language, still spoken today by several million people in the Yucatan, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. Cultural resistance, supported by the continuation of rituals traditionally associated with chac or maize, appears as the logical continuation of these centuries of adaptation. Contemporary inhabitants, whether they identify as Maya or by more specific names, Quiche, Yucatec, Mam, and many others, maintain an identity link that dates back to the post-classic era, if not earlier. Through the centuries, the Maya civilization has never truly vanished. Its legacy persists, not only in language and traditions, but also in the knowledge it has bequeathed to the world. Astronomy and mathematics, once developed in the great cities of the classical era, continue to fascinate with their precision. The Maya calendar, based on complex cycles of time, testifies to an advanced understanding of celestial movements, still influencing studies of ancient civilizations today. One of the most remarkable contributions of the Mayas lies in their use of zero, an advancement that transformed their way of conceiving time and numbers. While ancient Europe and China functioned without a true zero, and India would not formalize its mathematical use until several centuries later, the Mayas had already incorporated it into their vigesimal numeric system. As early as the 1st century before Christ, they had developed a distinct symbol, shaped like an oval shell, to represent the absence of value, a fundamental element that enabled them to encode their complex calendars. In a world where most civilizations were still unaware of this notion, Maya scribes were already using it to calculate calendrical cycles of cosmic reach, anticipating eclipses, and setting their rituals according to celestial order. While the Babylonians contented themselves with a simple marker to signify the absence of a digit, and the Western world would only adopt this concept through Indian mathematics, transmitted by Arab scholars more than a millennium later, the Mayas had already integrated it into their system of numeration and timekeeping. An invention born in the heart of the American jungles, well before the rest of the world realized its importance.